Hi, I'm Professor Engelhardt. We're going to be picking up with our series on the principles of macroeconomics, this time looking at the impacts of government borrowing from a macroeconomic perspective. So the big things we're going to be looking at is first, how does the government budget connect with broader markets for saving and investment? And our goal here is then to make that connection. We also want to look at the relationship between the trade deficit and the budget deficit, if there is such a relationship. This is what we call the twin deficits. And then we're going to look at how government spending might potentially impact long-run growth and consider, then, how is the government budgets do have an impact? So it all starts with the national saving and investment identity. So we've seen this before in other videos, but I think it's worth a review. So there are two different ways of looking at GDP. So one is from the income concept. So we know that GDP, the gross domestic product, is the final value of all goods and services that are produced within an economy in a particular time period. But one consequence of this is that we have good income from that. So we can think about how that income is disposed, right? So we can think of this really in three main categories. That is, any income I get goes one of three places. I use it for consumption, I use it for savings, or I use it to pay taxes. Then we can also think of GDP from the aggregate demand concept. So we know that the various areas of spending in the economy include consumption, investment, government purchases, and net exports. So when we put all of this together, we can take these two concepts, they should be equal, set them equal, and then we cancel out consumption because it appears in both equations. We end up with this equation, that is that savings plus investment, savings plus taxes rather, are equal to investment plus government purchases plus net exports. So put another way, we can think of it as savings and taxes fund investment, government, and net exports. Now, a little bit of rearranging here allows us then to highlight the importance of the government budget. So it's just a couple steps of algebra. What we end up with is the result that the budget deficit is going to be equal to the amount of savings we have in the economy, subtracting off the amount of investment, and then adding in the trade deficit. We know the trade deficit would be the negative of net exports. So one of the things that follows from this is that if you have an increase in the government deficit and nothing else adjusts, then one of three things has to happen. Right? We either have to have an increase in private savings, or we have to have a decrease in private investment, or we have to have an increase in the trade deficit. And this really just communicates the three different ways that government can fund its borrowing. It can fund it from private savings here domestically, either because we save more or because we are investing privately less, so more of our savings can go to the government, or we have to invest foreign monies. This is what the trade deficit would communicate. So then there are a number of different costs associated with the budget deficit. So one would be that people have to save more, a result of that being we have to consume less, right? Or we're investing less, that is also a cost, or we have to borrow from abroad, and that's, as I said, it shows up in the trade deficit. Right, so in aggregate demand terms, we'd expect then an increase in government spending is going to lead to a fall in consumption, investment, or net exports. So let's look at some of these effects. So one would be, what about the effect of lower investment? Well, here is what we call crowding out. Right? So crowding out is what happens when we have an increase in government spending and that gets offset by a decrease in investment. And this is something that can cause significant long-term problems. After all, investment, one of the places it goes, is building up the physical capital that we have in our economy. And we know that long-term growth depends, at least in part, on having that physical capital. So if crowding out happens and we have less physical capital, that's going to hurt long-term growth. And so this would suggest that a large budget deficit could be a problem for long-term growth if it prevents that investment in physical capital. What about trade deficits? After all, one possibility is that we have the budget deficit gets matched, right, with an increase in the trade deficit. That is, we're effectively borrowing from abroad. This would allow us then, we don't have to save anymore, so it wouldn't hurt domestic consumption. We don't have to cut back domestic investment, right? So it's purely coming from abroad. So might this be a good option? Well, there are a few issues that can arise here. So the reality is that if we have large, sustained trade deficits, that's going to lead to large debts that we owe to foreigners. Now, that in itself isn't necessarily a problem, but it does kind of put us in a precarious financial situation. Now, one option is that we could engage in what we call sovereign default. The problem is that sovereign default tends to be very costly for a government, for an economy, over a period of time. So let's take a look at this in a little bit more detail. Right, so first, how is it that there would be a connection between the budget deficit and the trade deficit? And so the logic goes something like this. Right? If we have a larger deficit, that is a larger budget deficit, right, then that's going to increase the demand for loanable funds, since the government has to borrow more. Well, if there's an increase in the demand for loanable funds, that leads to higher interest rates, say in the United States, where I'm speaking from. If we have higher interest rates in the US, that's going to attract foreigners from abroad to start lending in the United States, right? So we see then a greater demand for dollars so that foreigners can then lend those dollars. But the greater demand for dollars leads the dollar to appreciate over time. And as the dollar appreciates, that makes our exports look more expensive. It makes imports look cheaper in the US. So we end up exporting less, importing more, so we get a larger trade deficit as a result. And so we then can have this possible connection between the twin deficits of the budget deficit and the trade deficit. So the precarious position that puts us in. The reality is, right, that if investors from abroad own a lot of our assets, right, so say they own a lot of stocks in the stock market, or they own a lot of our government bonds, there's the potential for them to say, well, we don't actually want to be invested in America anymore, so they just pull their funds. Now, if they do that and do so quickly, we know that that can lead to the currency depreciating. After all, we'd see a big drop in the demand for the dollar. The dollar would lose a lot of value very quickly, which on the one hand would help to improve the trade deficit, but on the other hand puts our financial institutions in a really serious situation. And that is, any financial institutions that borrow from abroad would end up losing net worth. Because what do? You're borrowing in a foreign currency, you're then lending in dollars. So you have all of your assets are in dollars. If the dollar loses value relative to the other currencies, now your assets have lost value, your liabilities haven't. You just lost a bunch of net worth, and that could potentially lead to bankruptcy. Now, we haven't really seen this play out that much in the United States, simply because American financial institutions tend to borrow in dollars and lend in dollars, but we have seen this scenario play out in other countries. For example, in the 1990s, we had the Asian crisis, which very much played out along these lines. So we do know that there is some potential danger here. Now, one option, of course, is if you find yourself owing a lot of money to somebody, you can't default. Right? So to default simply means you're not paying your debts as agreed. So sometimes we can see a total default, that is, we simply don't pay anything at all. More often, we see things like a delay in when you're going to pay interest, that kind of thing. Right? So we might delay payments, would be a very common way that we'd see this work out. So when a government does this, we call it sovereign default. That is, it is a sovereign, that is the government, that has decided it is not going to pay back its debts as originally agreed. Now, I will say this is something that's actually quite common. If you look historically, there are very few countries that have not defaulted on their debt in one way or another. In fact, the United States is one of the very few exceptions to that case. It's one of the reasons that American government bonds are seen as extremely safe, is they have a very good track record of actually paying them. Now, so why is it, if this is a common thing, why is it that we don't just do this all the time? After all, it seems like it would be very beneficial to be able to just borrow a bunch of money, you spend it to fund whatever the government wants to do, and then you just don't pay it back. Well, the big downside is that, well, like with bankruptcy from a personal standpoint, if you go through bankruptcy, then it's very clear that you're much more of a risk, right? So we don't so much want to lend to you. And there is reasonable evidence that those countries that do default on their debt have a much much more difficult time borrowing in the future for some period of time, something like a decade or so. Now, another issue that we certainly need to talk about when it comes to concerns about government borrowing is what we call Ricardian equivalence. So Ricardian equivalence is a concept which we can trace back at least some of the ideas of it to David Ricardo, who's a fairly early economist around the early 1800s. And what Ricardian equivalence suggests is that there are really two ways to fund government spending. Like, one option is to tax now. Right? So the government wants to fund a new program, well, we need to increase taxes to fund that program. Now, another option would be borrowing, which borrowing is really just a promise to increase taxes in the future. Now, what Ricardian equivalence tells us is that if taxpayers are rational and forward-looking, then it really doesn't matter which of these two we do, we're going to end up with the same effect on consumption. So let's fill out some of the logic as to why that would be the case. So the first option is to increase taxes. So if we increase taxes now, what happens? Well, people are going to have less spendable income. So yes, I have income, but more of it's going to taxes. As a result, I have to consume less. Right? So we end up then with less consumption. What if instead the government decides to borrow? Right? So if it's increasing borrowing, I, as a rational household, am going to look into the future and say, well, borrowing is just a promise to tax me in the future, so I need to make sure that I'm ready for that. So what I'm going to do is take money, I'm going to set it aside in savings for that future tax bill, which will include both the amount that the government's borrowing plus the interest on top of it. The good news, the saving that I do will earn interest. In fact, maybe I'll save by buying those government bonds that the government is issuing. Right? So we end up with the same result. We have less consumption, either because we directly took the money out of people's income in the form of taxes, or because people bought the bonds and therefore don't have that money to consume. So as long as consumers are rational and forward-looking, it really shouldn't matter what mix we use between taxes and borrowing to fund whatever our expenses happen to be. However, when you look at the data, an increase in government borrowing of $1 tends to lead to about 30 cents more saving. Now, this isn't what's supposed to happen. According to Ricardian equivalence, $1 of government borrowing should lead to $1 of more saving. But that's not what happens. We see significantly less of an increase. Now, an increase is there, so there is some level of Ricardian equivalence that happens, but it's not really equivalence. Right? It's much less than equivalent. So the question is why? Right? What is it that led to this happening? Well, there are really three possibilities. So one possibility is that households just aren't rational. Or maybe they're not informed. Right? So it might be that households just don't know, right, that the government's out there borrowing money. Possibly. It might be that households aren't forward-looking. So even if we see, yeah, we know that the government's out there borrowing money, we don't really connect that with the fact that a government borrowing is a government promising to raise taxes in the future. If we don't make that connection, right, then we're not necessarily going to save money for those future taxes if we don't see that coming. And then the last possibility is the heterogeneity and uncertainty connected with households. Let's look at this one in a little more detail. Right, so when I say heterogeneity, what I mean here, right, is simply that different households are different. Or, but more specifically, different households have different tax burdens. So, for example, your family size has an impact, right, on your tax burden. In my case, I have 4 kids. 4 kids, a wife, and me. Turns out we don't have to pay a lot in taxes because we get lots of personal exemptions for our children. So that's something that, okay, yeah, maybe in the future we're going to have an increased tax burden, but it's not necessarily going to fall on me. Right? Similarly, things like income level. Right? We know that below a certain level of income, you're going to pay relatively little in income taxes. You'll still have payroll taxes, but income taxes specifically, you'll pay little or nothing. But in that case, okay, if you believe that you're going to be in that group, yeah, okay, maybe taxes are going to increase, but not on me. So why should I have any kind of change in my behavior? Similarly, the type of income, so things like business income versus employee income, these are treated differently by the tax code. So it's very possible for people to say, well, yes, I know that taxes are going to increase in some general way, but I don't believe they're going to increase for me. Right? So again, this heterogeneity in households and what our tax burdens looks like means that it's possible that people might over-identify themselves as not having to bear that additional burden. Okay? So combine this then with the uncertainty that, yeah, we know taxes are going up in the future, but we don't really know what kinds of taxes. Right? This can lead people to act in this kind of, in some sense, overconfident way, where we just act like, yeah, somebody's taxes are going to go up, probably not mine, so I might save a little bit more, maybe 30 cents on the dollar, right? But I don't really feel a need to save dollar for dollar because, again, I don't know that it's going to be me. And the last big topic I'm going to look at is the connection between fiscal policy and long-term growth. Now, we know from things we've talked about previously is that long-term growth really comes from a combination of three sources. That is, physical capital, human capital, and technology or productivity increases. So for us to have an economy that grows over the long term, and not just in total, but for the average person, we need to build up these three things. There's two forms of capital, physical and human, and technology or improvements in total factor productivity. So this is where the government can come in and it provides some of these forms of investment. So for example, when you look at physical capital, now we have, say in the United States, we have private physical capital, that is physical capital that is funded not by government but by private organizations. So in the US, most factories, machinery and the like would fall into this category, where we tend not to see government-owned factories. On the other hand, there are forms of physical capital where it is government or publicly funded, infrastructure being the most obvious thing, so things like roads and bridges, these are things that typically are government responsibilities, right? So they are also part of the physical capital that make us more productive, more connected in transportation. This then would be something that the government can contribute to our growth by investing wisely in infrastructure. The second major category would be human capital. So that would be things like skills, training, education. So on the private side, we see things like on-the-job training that comes from employers, or private education. So like the private school system would be a privately funded form of building up human capital. Of course, we also have a large public education system. So like myself, I work for a state university. I went to a public school. So from kindergarten, even pre-K now, all the way up through senior year of high school, these are often publicly funded throughout the United States at least, right? And even up into college, you have at least partially publicly funded schooling. So these investments that are made in people's skills and people's education are something that may potentially have an impact on future growth, assuming those investments are wise. And finally, when we look at that general category of technology, probably the easiest way to see investment in that is things like research and development, which we know that private companies do this, especially in the high-tech sectors. So this would be a form of spending that happens privately in order to improve overall growth. But we also see things happen from the government that is to encourage technology. Now, some of it is direct research and development that the government funds or does, and then some of it is just incentives. So things like providing significant patents. This would be one way of providing an incentive for private research and development to happen. Or subsidizing investment in research and development. This would be another thing where it is public funds going to encourage the development of technology. So in this way, right, public funds and private funds combine to create an impact on economic growth. This does, however, raise a number of important questions about, well, what is the appropriate level of public investment? And this raises a number of other questions that are connected with that. So what is the right amount of growth, right? So after all, we know that when we invest resources, we can either invest in them in what we're consuming today, so that is present consumption, right? Or we can invest in future growth. Right? We only have so many resources available to us, and when it comes down to it, we have to make the choice how much we want to have future consumption versus future growth. I think I said future twice. But in any case, present consumption versus future consumption or investment in that future growth. And this is something where there isn't really a single right answer. It really depends on what people's preferences are. So there are certainly people that would say, no, I'd rather consume everything now, and then if I'm impoverished in the future, so be it. But then other people who would say, no, I want to save a lot right now, invest in the future so that I can not have to worry about being impoverished then. Right? So what the right balance is here is something that is not immediately obvious. Another question is, well, what is the right mix of public versus private? So this raises questions like, well, which one is more effective? If we have this extra dollar, would it be better, right, for us to allow companies to go out and invest that dollar in research and development and building factories and so on? Or would it be better to tax that dollar away and have the government make these decisions about, say, building up infrastructure or which specific research and development they want to encourage? So it's really a question of, well, which of these is going to be more effective? And another question would be, which is more fair? Right, so it might well be, and there are times that we see people make these kinds of choices, where yes, we know that one of these options is going to be more effective in the sense of give us more bang for the buck, but we might say that it's not necessarily more fair, either because of, say, the way that the government operates, we think the way that they take taxes is not really fair, or the other way around, that we think that the way that the private sector distributes resources is not really fair, so the government needs to have more of a hand in making those decisions, right? So these are things where these get into really tricky questions to which there isn't necessarily one obvious correct answer. And that's all on this one. So again, thank you for watching. It's Prof. signing off.